Hi, I'm Tash, and I'm the marketing manager at Cosive.
Chris Horsley, I'm the CTO at Cosive and one of the co-founders. Let's imagine you're working in an organization, you're a security analyst, and your role is very much operational. So we're talking about, detecting threats and, deploying security controls and all of those things. And you keep hearing about CTI a lot, and you start to wonder, what should I be doing? Everyone seems to be doing this CTI thing. What should I be doing? So yeah, that really leads to that first question about, well, what is it and how do we define it? And I think a nice way to define it is that it's knowing what's going on, being the eyes and the ears of the organization, and helping people in the organization make decisions with intelligence, information in their hands to help them do that in an informed way. And that's really what it is at its core. To me, it's how do we make decisions, and we're factoring in what's going on out there in the world. And so we're factoring in all of those things when we're making decisions, and we're not making them blind or in an uninformed way. Sometimes I think when people approach CTI for the first time, they see, how the military might do threat intelligence. And a lot of that lingo, I think, has leaked through into cyber threat intelligence, because it really does have a lot of basis in, military threat intelligence from thousands and thousands of years ago. That's the army knowing what's going on, or a military force. That's the eyes and the ears of the military force. Like, what's the enemy's strength? Where are they now? What armaments do they have? What are the likely tactics they'll be using against us? And that really takes us fast forward to now and cyber threat intelligence. And at its core, there's a lot of similarities there. But I think sometimes people can be put off by the language, the frameworks, the fact that a lot of organizations spend a lot of money on tools and feeds and analysts and all of those things. So if we go back to our example of you're in the thick of it day to day, you're putting out all the fires, you're running all of the security tools. What can we do to get from zero to something approaching a CTI program? And the good news is you are probably already doing something. You may not even realize that what you are doing could probably be classified as being called CTI. So I guess we'll get into what those things might be and what's the level zero maturity look like, let's say. And when we're talking about level zero maturity, we're saying it's very ad hoc. There's no management around it. There's no real systematic thinking. But I bet there are things that you as a small team analyst are doing right now that we would say are activities that belong to the CTI family.
And some analysts might feel like they need special skills in order to do CTI, or there's certain skills that they don't have. Do you think that's true, or do you think any analyst can do CTI?
I would agree with some opinions that some people are very predisposed to being good threat intelligence analysts. And a lot of it comes down to mindset, because I've always subscribed to this idea that threat intelligence, a lot of it is about opinions. Sometimes we get to deal with hard facts, but let's take the example of attribution, where we're deciding who carried out a particular attack or who is behind a particular threat. We have to gather evidence. We have to assess that evidence. We have to decide if there is a proper relationship, correlation between maybe previous things we've seen from a threat actor and what we're seeing in our case. And is that a true correlation or relationship, or is it coincidental? Do they just happen to be using the same IP address, 1 year apart, because that IP address got reused, in AWS, let's say? So we have a range of evidence, but then we have a bunch of opinions, theories that we have to test before we come up with a level of confidence that we can assert about, is this threat, the way we're describing it, is it accurate? So I think coming back to what makes a good threat intel analyst, it's having a level of skepticism, having an objectiveness, but also a level of, I would say, sort of creativity, and an ability to sort of think about new hypotheses. So that's the creativity part. How do I test my hypothesis that what I contend might be happening is something I can substantiate through evidence? And at what level of confidence could I substantiate that? And there is training to do this sort of stuff as well. But I think, certainly some people have an instinctive feel for how they come to conclusions versus wild theories and throwing them out there and just, let's say, making the theory first, putting all the eggs in that basket until you are proved wrong. A good threat and intelligence analyst should be prepared to review, question their own conclusions at any time, and do that in a somewhat dispassionate way. And don't feel like somebody who, let's say, came up with a theory was disproven and double down as a result of that. There's certain personality types, that's their go-to. When proven wrong, just dig in harder. That will not make for a good threat intelligence analyst, of course.
And you mentioned that security analysts might already be doing threat intelligence without even realizing it. Can you touch on that a little bit more on what those things might be?
Yeah, so earlier we said that when we're running threat intelligence in an organization, you're the eyes and ears of that organization. So if you're already doing things like reading blog posts, participating in communities, let's say you're in a Slack channel, a Discord channel, you're on Twitter, and you are following threats, you're following what threat actors are doing, malware families, ransomware attacks, the latest tactics of phishing crews, let's say. You are absorbing all of this information about techniques and tactics, threat landscape, threat actors, what's happening on the nation state level, what's happening within criminal gangs. What you're really doing there is you are doing intelligence gathering. But you might be at that point where all of the intelligence is living in your brain. And that makes it hard to share with the rest of your team and your organization and get to outcomes. So that is most likely the thing you are already doing. If you're switched on, if you're engaged, and you're not just going in to the office every day and just plowing through alert tickets without thinking too much about, like, where do these alerts come from? What are we missing? So that, I think, is the distinction between somebody who is, let's say, an operator in a cybersecurity team and someone who is prime to be a threat intelligence analyst. You've got that curiosity to gather information, to learn more, and take what's out there in the wild, because there's a lot of information we can draw from, and then turn all of that into contextualized intelligence for our organization. I just read about this. How does that apply to what our organization does and the infrastructure we run and the systems we have and the security controls that we have? Like, if you're thinking that way, you've made that first footstep into being a threat intelligence analyst already, even if you don't know it.
And if an analyst wants to start sharing some of the threat intelligence and research that they're doing, what are some ways that they could start doing that in a more structured way?
I've seen many levels of maturity over the years, and I won't say any of them are incorrect at all, because it's going to depend on number of people, your budget, what tools you have at hand already. I'm a big believer in, when we're thinking about how to shake up a program of work, and it could be security operations or threat intelligence. I mean, sometimes when somebody comes in and assesses and they say, hey, here's where you're at, and here's where you need to get to, and they'll recommend, this massive budgetary spend, let's get the tools that are best of breed, and we're going to get a team of 20 analysts and all this. For a lot of organizations, impossible. They just don't yet. Maybe one day they'll have the buy-in from management to get those sorts of budgets. But for the next couple of years, we have to really prove the worth and the concept. So let's talk about the constraints in terms of people, budget, tooling, and work with those things. And it might be, to start with, there's 2 of you, and you use Slack and a wiki, and that's what you have to work with. And you can start with those things. So even if you are sharing blog posts on Slack in a channel with your other coworker, I would argue that's the beginning of threat intelligence sharing. And there's a lot we can do with it, mind you, but that's technically what we're doing. Is now we're taking some of the stuff that's inside our head and putting it into a repository of information. And you could do this in the wiki just as well, of course. Now, where it goes from, I'm just pasting links from the internet into a Slack channel, to something we could describe as threat intelligence, is that contextualized understanding. So I'm reading this blog post, thinking about what we do in our organization, and writing some analysis. And it might just be a few bullet points to start with. In this very low budget scenario we're talking about, I'm just going to write 3 bullet points to say, we run this software, this is a critical vulnerability, this is our crown jewel system, so we need to take action on this immediately. So that's our assessment of what is described in this blog post. And now we have related it from, say, what a security company has done, down to what do we have to do in an organization about this. So those are the humble beginnings of, a repository sharing and making it so that we can scale it past one person.
Who should analysts think about sharing threat intelligence with in their organization? I guess the obvious one that you mentioned is other people in their team. Are there other people that they should think about sharing threat intel with?
Absolutely. In fact, you have nailed really one of the most important questions. So if we were going to start a formal CTI program, the first question is, why are we doing it and for whose benefit in the organization? So one of the first things we need to do is identify stakeholders. And typically those are going to be executives who need to make, because remember, we're talking about CTI is about decision-making and taking actions. So for the executive level, it's about, well, high level, what sort of threats is our organization facing? Classic one would be ransomware. And with ransomware, we have many technical controls we can bring to bear, like EDR and alerting systems and things like that. But for the executive level, they're thinking about how likely is it to happen? Is our sector being targeted? What are those initial ways that they gain access to an organization? What are we doing? And this is decision making at a high level. What sort of budget do we need to allocate to make sure this doesn't happen to us? Is our security team well funded enough? And when we talk to them, can we gauge like how much this is a priority for them? And then you've got the business side of things as well. If we were ransomed, what do we do then? So do we have cyber insurance? When we have cyber insurance, what sort of support can they give us during a ransomware case? Business continuity planning. If our whole workstation fleet got taken out, how do we fall back to a paper and pen method? How long would it take us to restore? Like, all of these questions are business level questions rather than technical level questions. So a big stakeholder are those executives who will be making those business level decisions. That's our high level business stakeholders. Second one are going to be our other technical teams. So let's say we're monitoring for vulnerabilities and exploits against new vulnerabilities. That's something we're really interested in, because ideally we know what assets and infrastructure we're running. And that's not a given in many organizations because they're horribly complicated, ill-documented setups. So that's the first challenge, is what systems we run, how exposed are they, what security controls do we have, would they even work against these threats? So those are sorts of things that technical teams need to know, and they're probably not in the security team. They're going to be platform teams, infrastructure teams. There might be other capabilities in the organization who are going to, again, be stakeholders when we as the threat intel analysts, and we may not even have that job title, but it's kind of de facto part of our role because we're doing all this reading like we're talking about and sharing stuff on Slack. How are we going to tell them about it? And sometimes that might be in a formal way, and sometimes an informal heads up. Maybe at this very low level of maturity, we find out about this vulnerability and we happen to know that, yeah, absolutely, we run this. It might be a VPN concentrator. And we know we run that sort of equipment. We need to immediately tell that team, hey, there's new vulnerability. It's in the wild, being exploited. We need to patch this thing ASAP. Otherwise, our organization is going to be compromised, as many have been in the past. And again, this is threat landscape type. This is both timely information, but also with threat landscape, is that once there's a VPN concentrated vulnerability, it is very quickly exploited because it is the gateway into a lot of organizations. And then they're going to move through that organization, exploiting more and more and achieving various objectives, which could be data exfiltration, or it could be ransomware and encrypting the fleet. Again, this is threat intelligence work where we know the typical movements, objectives, tactics, and procedures of those types of attackers.
So you hear the phrase intelligence products used quite a bit when talking about starting to do threat intelligence, defining your products. So how do you understand that, and what does that mean to you?
I think along with not identifying and engaging with those stakeholders at the beginning, where we're sitting down and asking them, how do you do your job? What do you need? That's usually the number one way that a CTI program fails, because you can do all of the gathering and you can have all the expensive tools and the feeds, but if we don't know what the outcomes of what we're supposed to be doing are, then I've seen CTI programs fail on that basis, even though they spent all the money. because they didn't ask the question. To me, it's something like software development, where we need to know what the finished product kind of looks like and then work backwards from there to work out how to achieve that objective. Same with CTI programs. And I've seen it where, yeah, all the budget is allocated, all the tools are bought, but we don't know how to measure what success looks like. So where intelligence products fit into this. So let's say we've talked to all our stakeholders, we understand how they work, what they're responsible for, what they need to know. So the next thing we're going to do is work out, all right, so how are we going to find out what they need to know, and how would they want to receive this information? So this is what we would call intelligence products. And these are then the things every day, we're working towards. So let's go back to the example of executives. They want briefings, and they're going to be reading those briefings. They're intended for human consumption, and we'll talk about automated consumption later. So they want a threat briefing. So they might take, we as the threat intelligence team, or the de facto threat intelligence team, we're reading this blog post, we understand what's in there, we're going to contextualize it to our organization and explain how is this a risk to us and what should we do about it. And we're going to write that up as a briefing to be sent to our executive level. And now they know, and we're writing this very succinctly, because you might have found a blog post that's 15 pages long on a security vendor page, and it goes into incredibly low levels of detail about how this threat works and how they analyze and all those things. The executives don't want to know any of that stuff. They just want to know, how important is this? What's the impact? What's the recommended course of action? And I'm going to talk about course of action quite a lot, because that's, again, the concrete outcomes that we get from gathering and analyzing threat intelligence. So that would be one of our intelligence products, could be PDF briefings for our executives talking about threat to the organization. Another intelligence product would be, so let's say you are in the incident response team, and you also have a security operations center. And the security operations center is responsible for all the alerting. So this is looking for bad domain names, looking for particular techniques being used by threat actors. So all of this is going to be informed by threat intelligence too. So what are those bad domains we should be having a look at? And there are plenty of data feeds out there we can use, and data feeds is a whole tangential topic. But what they're probably looking for is a technical feed of maybe indicators of compromise, rules that we can use to detect activities from known threat actors that they can then deploy as detection, because they're running the organizational SIEM. So they're looking for these data feeds that we're going to provide to them. And then we have to talk as a whole other topic about how do we qualify and guarantee the quality of those feeds, and distill it down to something that's actionable, doesn't have false positives. So we might supply that to them as it could be we're going to export indicator compromise to Splunk, and they know that we're doing that. So that's our product to them, is this feed we're supplying to Splunk, and they're going to be detecting for these indicators of compromise. Or it could be a series of rules. Maybe Sigma rules are one way to do this, and they're going to be translated into Splunk logic, and then they can go and look for those things in our environment and see if these threats are present here. I very much like to break it down to the human types of intelligence products, and those technical level, maybe almost automated or semi-automated security intelligence products as well.
And would you recommend that analysts start with the human level research, like reading blog posts and things like that, and then later on look at potentially starting to consume an automated feed later on, or do both at the same time, or in the other opposite order?
I think most analysts will probably start just naturally, if they've got that inclination, that they'll start with that human gathering. So that's, like we were talking about earlier. So using your networks, your professional networks, blog posts, an RSS reader, all of those things. Later, we can start to use some of those feeds, and we start to need tooling here, which you might start with very simple scripts. Could be a Python script, which is pulling RSS feeds or pulling data from CSVs that are getting published every day. Or we start to introduce formal tools, which could be MISP, could be a threat intelligence platform, which speaks STIX and TAXI. But we start to get those feeds in. But personally, I think we would always do both of those things, because one continual gripe, I guess, is that a lot of those blog posts don't have machine representations. So while we humans can go and read it and understand how it hangs together, and we can understand the techniques, we can observe the IOCs and the description of how this threat unfolds. While we have MISP and we have sticks to describe these on a machine level, many vendors don't do it for time, or maybe it's not a priority for them. And there are tools that can do these sorts of like human readable analysis to machine readable CTI package, which is a whole other topic in itself. But yeah, so our human gathering activities can also feed these types of systems and turn them into structured data that we can use to push out that, say, that Splunk IOC feed, so that we can do detections based on what we're reading and what is relevant to the organization. One mistake I've seen quite often is where we think about indicators of compromise or other intelligence in a tool as a volume game. So the more intelligence we get, the better the outcomes. And generally speaking, that's not the case. What we want is high quality, relevant, actionable threat intelligence. And we do that by picking, I guess, the right feeds and having the workflows that let us assess, evaluate, and filter what we're bringing into our threat intelligence platform. And you might start that threat intelligence platform, it could be an Excel spreadsheet. And I don't recommend that necessarily, but maybe that's what you have to hand. And then we're populating that either in a manual, a semi-automated, or a fully automated way, that as we bring in these feeds, we're translating to something else that we can use inside the organization as well.
Are there any feeds in particular that would be good for analysts to maybe start with as their first feed, or any tips on how to look for a feed that might be most appropriate for the organization?
There are a number of public feeds out there. I mean, one I can give a shout out to is Circle, one of the national cybersecurity incident response teams in Luxembourg. They have a very good MISP feed. It's really well structured. It's well analyzed. So if you want to look at an example of like how to, a good example of a well structured public feed, you can go and have a look at their feed. And they also run a MISP community as well, which has other sorts of sharing going on too. There are quite a few public feeds like this, and some of them are sort of in mixed in quality. So some of them just are piping malware hashes through a sandbox, and they generate a feed out of that. And it's good for the purposes of high automation, but there's very little context quite often provided. And context is a word we use a lot in threat intelligence, because if I have just an IP address or just a hash and I don't know what threat it's related to, if I was to find that IP, if I was to find that hash, what do I do now? So I got it in a feed, so I'm assuming it's bad, but how bad is it? Is it there was a phishing site hosted here bad? Or is it, oh, this is the command and control of a ransomware crew, and if I see that in my organization, it means the machines are getting encrypted as we speak. So without that really important context to the nature of the threat connected to the IOC, we're in trouble. So a lot of the free feeds we see, some of them are excellent, like Circle's feed. Others, they are very high volume and noisy, but they do lack that context at times. And then we can start to talk about, commercial feeds. And there's a lot of great commercial feed providers. And I won't mention any by name here, but yes, and they can often cost high amounts of dollars, because it is expensive to gather this sort of intelligence and have the right analysts and the right types of systems and the right sort of quality control, because one threat intelligence report could take weeks, months of analysis to get to the point where we're satisfied. If we're about to call out a nation state as being behind a certain malware campaign, that could take multiple analysts a long time to develop. And these are expensive types of analyses to do. So some of those top level commercial feeds are also quite expensive. And so we've got to be quite a ways, have the organization committed to a CTI program before we're at that point of being able to use those sorts of feeds.
So let's say an analyst is starting to do threat intelligence, starting to share it with the organization, maybe tapping into an automated feed, getting that shipped to Splunk. How can they start to measure the success of their early efforts in threat intelligence?
We can come up with, maybe KPIs, and we've got these metrics that talk about, well, how many, I don't know, briefings are we going to ship per week, per month? How many, where I've seen it's where we get into very, walking on thin ice territory and we're a bit dangerous is when we're saying like, oh, we're going to ship 1,000 indicators of compromise a day. And that's kind of getting things backwards, in my opinion. We're really interested in outcomes. Was the threat intelligence that we sent, was it relevant? Was it actionable? What did the stakeholder think about it? Could they use it? Was it in a format that they understood? Was the way and the context that this threat intelligence was couched in, was that a thing they could understand? If it was automated, have they actually turned it into operational usage? There's nothing worse than going to all this effort and generating feeds, and it just ends up in a black hole on the other end, and they're not doing with it. And I've seen that happen plenty of times too, where we haven't got to the point, or maybe what happens, and this is where communication in the organization is so important. The threat intelligence team is working really hard to gather all this stuff and vet feeds and doing all this triage work before we send it over to maybe the detection team. The detection team was getting a lot of false positives, and they were just seeing again and again the threat intelligence was too old, because timeliness is a big requirement for good threat intelligence. So classic case I've heard of is that we still have detection rules for an IP address from a year ago, and then we see a hit on that same IP address today. The problem is that IP address belonged to an EC2 host of an AWS. It was a Linux box, and that Linux box was used for something malicious a year ago. Now it's used for something benign. But all of our detection rules fire because it's still on a list of IOCs. We get all these false positives. And so the rational decision from the detection team is, let's turn off that feed because it's giving us bad outcomes. And it's just flooding us with alerts. The false positive rate is through the roof. It's just eating time. It's making us mistrust the detections that we have, the old problem of alarm fatigue. And so, yeah, that's doing more harm than good in that case. So really what the threat intelligence team needs to be doing is continually coming back to the stakeholders and saying, like, how are you going with this? Are you finding that what we're giving you is accurate? Are you doing something with it? Is it helping with your decision making? So to me, before you start thinking about like metrics, because we all want to get to the point, we want to be able to measure and then assess where were we a year ago? Where are we now? Has that number improved? Has it gotten closer to the target? When we're talking about that entry level, that de facto CTI team, communication and getting feedback, and then reviewing and iterating on how we're producing our intelligence products.
So it sounds like it's far better to produce a small amount of useful, actionable, insightful threat intelligence that people can go and apply and take action on than it is to generate a high volume of threat intelligence that just ends up being ignored or isn't actionable, or people don't know how to use it.
Yeah, exactly. So, and in fact, if we are very noisy as a threat intelligence team, and we've got all this low grade stuff that might be of interest to other people in the organization, when we send through that report, that's really important. And this is the thing we need to mitigate right now. We have the problem that it could get lost in the noise. If we don't have a way of somehow signaling that this is not like all the other things we produce, this is really important, we need to act on this now, chances are the other teams, they'll just stop looking. The same as anybody does with their email. When your inbox is just flooded every day with 100 new messages and there's one buried in there somewhere, which is a must read, much less chance people are going to pay attention to it if it's buried in all that noise.
Chris, one thing that could be cool is like giving, let's say an analyst is listening to this discussion, giving them like one small next step they could take to get started with CTI. So they're listening to this on their way home from work. They're going to go into work tomorrow. What's one small thing they could do to generate a bit of threat intelligence and practice sharing it?
So I would recommend maybe two things. First, I would recommend is, in fact, as of the time we are recording this, there has been published a new cyber threat intelligence maturity model guide, and it's called CTI CMM, which stands for exactly that, cyber threat intelligence capability maturity model. And I've read my way through it, and it's a really good roadmap for both what domains of threat intelligence are we talking about, how do we get to level 0 where we have that very ad hoc sort of management we talked about at the beginning, and getting to the point where we have, a very well-defined, mature, well-funded and resourced capability in the organization. So have a read of that, and it will really sort of paint the picture of what that whole spectrum. And don't expect, of course, to get to the top level. It will take years of work to get to that point, but you'll start to see, well, here is the place we're trying to get to, the sort of the nirvana of that, that top level maturity of a cyber threat intelligence program. So I'd recommend having a read of that. The other thing I would recommend is just from the beginning, getting involved in some of those professional communities and it could be, again, Slack, Discord, LinkedIn, in spite of all the noise and the thought leadership on there, it is sometimes an excellent resource for when people are talking about new emerging threats, if you follow the right people and you're plugged into the right networks. So I would start to use those networks. If you are time poor, your colleagues in your industry, in your country, in your company, make excellent filters in their own right. The more people you see talking about a thing, that is also an indication sometimes of priority. Now, naturally, we have to be thinking about what our organization does too. But if you are very time poor and you're doing the operational level work and you're doing this ad hoc CTI work, that's a really good place. Use your networks to also get things on your radar, because if they're important, if they're critical, if they're really timely, other people are going to be talking about it too.